We head back once more across the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Our last candidate, and perhaps the strongest contender for Atlantis, is an island that lies close to ancient Greece. Here, one of the most sophisticated cities ever to have arisen in the ancient world was blown to smithereens in one of the worst natural disasters in human history. Perhaps this is, once and for all, the origin of the legend of Atlantis. Naked science is on the trail of Plato's lost city of Atlantis. Although explorers and cranks have claimed dozens of sites to be the remains of the lost civilization, probably the best candidate of all is the Greek island of Santorini. Here in 1967, archaeologists sensationally discovered a beautifully preserved ancient city buried deep below the earth. They quickly established that it belonged to an advanced civilization, the Minoans, based on the nearby island of Crete. Famous for their magnificent palaces and beautiful frescoes, the Minoans controlled a vast empire long before the rise of classical Greece. But about 3,400 years ago, they suddenly and mysteriously disappeared. Might this be the civilization of which Plato spoke? The stunning discovery drew the attention of scientist and writer Charles Pellegrino.
The city itself is a very fascinating find. When they started finding internal plumbing through the walls of the homes, very advanced technology, advanced use of water, and aqueduct systems, the like of which we did not really see again till about the time of the Roman Empire.
Like many others, Pellegrino began to wonder if Santorini was the site of Plato's Atlantis. There are several similarities. For instance, the island's circular outline is reminiscent of the circular shape Plato describes. And from the small statues of bulls and the frescoes of bull leapers, it's clear that the Minoans, like Plato's Atlanteans, worshipped the bull. And there's more. Plato says Atlantis was made up of rocks which were black, white, and red. The same is true of Santorini.
If you pull rocks out of here rather randomly, you'll find the original bedrock limestone, the original bedrock volcanic rock, interestingly, just as Plato had described the rocks of Atlantis.
But there's one thing above all else that makes people sit up and take the idea seriously. Santorini and its city were destroyed by a massive volcanic eruption.
We're right now on the very edge of an 8-mile wide blowhole in the earth. All of it going off right in this spot.
The explosion was 90 times bigger than the eruption of Mount St. Helens. As the volcano erupted, it spewed out a massive pyroclastic flow, a terrifying avalanche of hot rocks and scalding gases.
Races across the land, slashing down trees, ripping up buildings, acting more like a fluid than a gas. And it's also very, very hot.
It's hard to believe that a single volcanic blast can wipe out an entire city in minutes. But there have been many cases where this has happened. This is Saint-Pierre on the Caribbean island of Martinique. Above the town sits Mount Pelée. The volcano is peaceful now, but on May 8th, 1902, it blew its top. A superheated cloud of gas and volcanic ash surged down the volcano and tore into the town of Saint-Pierre. The inhabitants stood no chance. 29,000 people were killed. Only 2 survived. In more recent times, pyroclastic flows destroyed Plymouth, the former capital of the volcanic island of Montserrat, when they roared down the slopes of the volcano and buried the town. The ash and debris are so deep that today, only the tops of the houses are visible. But the eruption on Santorini was much bigger than this. From the layers of rock and ash laid down in the blast, Charles Pellegrino was able to paint a detailed picture of the events surrounding the eruption.
That creamy layer out there on top of that splinter of land that's left at the rim of the crater is about 200 feet of white pumice, which is marking the eruption as it was building and building and building toward the final explosion, the Great Ahum. This eruption was going on, emptying the magma chamber, creating a weak spot in the earth, and building up toward the top here until finally the thing collapsed, released the pressure, exploded.
After blowing its top, the volcano collapsed, creating a hole the size of Manhattan in the center of the island.
In the immediate aftermath of that explosion, you would have seen the water coming in over these cracks in what was left of the island, and one of these ships would have looked like just a mere twig going over the edge of Niagara Falls, and this would have made Niagara Falls look like a little trickle. Almost 4,000 years of history was derailed in an entirely new direction. It was pretty much the end of Minoan civilization, and that's what we're looking at up here. It was the end of their world.
So could Santorini itself be the true site of Atlantis? It had a sophisticated culture, and it was certainly wiped out by a lethal cataclysm. But there's just one problem. Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years earlier, and the explosion at Santorini happened around 1630 BC, only 1,300 years before Plato was writing. It's a major drawback, but it doesn't change Charles Pellegrino's conviction that this may well be the site of Atlantis.
There are scholars who've been arguing for years over whether Plato really meant 9,000 years ago or whether he meant 900 years ago. What Plato says is, he says it's a story based on something real, and you have to give him the right to be able to exaggerate if what he was creating was a kind of fable.
So how does Santorini fare on our Atlantis checklist? Admittedly, it isn't as old as Plato said. And there are no signs that elephants lived here. But the rocks are the color Plato described. It has a circular shape. There was definitely a strong cult of bull worship. And a huge part of the island sank beneath the waves. But is this enough to make it Atlantis?
This event occurred 900 years before Solon, not 9,000, as written in Plato's dialogues. But there's an interesting theory that could explain this discrepancy. Plato wrote that the story of Atlantis originally came from the Egyptians. They told it to the Greek scholar Solon when he paid a visit to one of their temples some 300 years before the time of Plato. In that age, the Egyptians counted time in lunar months, not just solar years. So it's possible that a simple error in translation could have entered the narrative. The Egyptians may not have been talking about an event that took place 9,000 years before, but rather 9,000 months. If this were the case, that would put the destruction of Atlantis at nearly the same time as the cataclysm of Thera. So there's a decent case for Thera being Atlantis, if you allow for a little error in translation.